I was thinking about adding this addendum to all the things that I've said to sort of explore some of the more underlying issues which are in fact concealed by the confused and dubious, sort of tricks that are being played in terms of using epistemic injustice to obviate epistemic agency, which, yeah, so I mean, this is going to be slightly dangerous, me discussing this, because I'm going to probably, you have to be so charitable in terms of even being discussing these unsound theoretical conceptual outlines that what I might say could be very easily taken out of context or not be sort of, because it'll be hard for me to keep on repeating all the caveats needed that sort of just derail this before it even starts going, because you have to cede so much to it in order just to animate it. You have to be completely sort of brainwashed by it in terms of providing charity to it in order to operate it, that it sort of just sort of leavens everything. It sort of just ends up sort of corrupting everything. So but this is yeah, so I mean, I would hate to sort of, I mean, what I say could very easily be repurposed by them, and I don't like the idea of arming the enemy, as it were, because they could very easily use what I'm going to discuss here to sort of bolster their conflation and their convoluting and disguising their own premises in their. But I mean, it's sort of this already culturally functions, so to some extent, just them getting to grips with it, or sort of knowing what they have to achieve in order to sort of stably sort of like try to create a pseudo intellectual edifice that they can use to operate from, when essentially they already gain and own so much cultural ground. Perhaps the downside is not there. So I mean, the risk of them repurposing what I'm saying in abject intellectual bad faith is not so far off or bad compared to what is already happening, essentially. But yeah, but it's I'm basically saying that I'm going to be being unreasonably charitable to their specious conception of things, because without even being that level of charitable, you can't even do anything with it. Like, so this is the problem, is that they force you to sort of like already sort of commit yourself before you can even sort of see what's going on. They force you to fudge it so that you're just as, let's say, on the hook as they are, that if the prescription like doesn't sort of reach the right outcome that is anticipated, then it's like because you see, like, if the anticipated outcome isn't delivered on, then it's like actually their process that they were advocating is actually the moral evil, is the nexus of a moral contagion or something like that. And so they want to sort of neatly sort of avoid that kind of accruing any kind of epistemic accountability, or moral accountability for their epistemic sort of jerry-rigged narrative, which they are judging from nowhere. Or actually, they're not judging it from nowhere. They're actually judging it in league with whatever relativism that they haven't yet decided is going to be the container that is going to be like a valid sort of ad hoc process to administer on top of everything. But okay, yeah. So I mean, this is going to sound as annoying as what I sound like right now, because I'm going to be getting into a lot of different things, I guess. Psychology, politics, and exploring some of the themes that I've seen present in people that supposedly are interested in epistemic responsibilism. So, and I'm going to try to underline where the thematic problems are. So I would say that they are all housed around the notion of, essentially, as soon as you start using this notion of a knowledge community, right? As soon as you start talking about knowledge communities, the actual, let's say, evil that epistemic injustice is actually badly trying to describe or badly trying to capture is a kind of collective vulnerable narcissism that's perpetrated by a knowledge community. But that is almost like, that is the systemic oppression or the ongoing suppression or whatever you want to call it, or the ongoing epistemicide. That is vaguely what they're actually referring to, is a kind of vulnerable narcissism. But what they don't understand about one of the properties of vulnerable narcissism, and now I'm going to sort of, this is going to sound inexact because psychology, the constructs that psychology use are, psychology is in its infancy. It really is a pathetic sort of system of knowledge itself. But anyway, I believe that my models and deep theory of mind sort of solve a lot of these sorts of things and get some metaphysical clarity, because I actually have a structured phenomenology and epistemology and things like that. But putting that aside, let me just explain why this vulnerable narcissism is very pernicious, and how the let's say the properties of vulnerable narcissism is a good analogy for how this is operating. So, if you are tracking knowledge communities and the culture within those knowledge communities, and you care about epistemic agency, then you start to sort of create a kind of a meta sort of idealized moral code of ethics or something like that sort of must be present in order just to keep the system clean and transparent or something like that. And you can almost derive a kind of objective matrix of rules and things like that. I really am emphasizing you could almost do those things. You shouldn't do those things. You should be clever enough not to do those things. But you can almost sort of approximate things like that. Now, having done those things, okay, I guess you've already sort of committed technical problems and things like that, in that you have divested epistemic agency and moral consideration from the individual, and you've sort of transported it into a kind of a meta-analysis that where you're going to judge it from. It's sort of it's a hypothetical sort of contention. It's a hypothetical sort of concern or worry or something like that. And it's very hard to actually find out at what point at which you actually are going to actuate or actualize or act on those sorts of insinuations that the conceptual framework of that seems to imply. Like, at what level does it actually get addressed or dealt with or promulgated or something like that? Or at what level does it manifest as policy? I would say that, to be as charitable as possible, you can sort of, it is a kind of sentimental way of having a kind of directive that you perhaps want to have in some policy, and I think that you can follow a vague kind of logic within it, and you can say, yeah, okay, just don't do it directly, do it indirectly. Don't try to accomplish it directly, try to accomplish it indirectly through other things that are covered by people's actual epistemic agency, rather than these agents of epistemic injustice that are going to enforce the redress or something like that. The matrix analogy is actually quite prescient in this kind of philosophical philandering, and these dubious, agents of epistemic redress. Or okay, anyway, I just made that point. So now, let me just say that. So essentially what they're trying to deal with is the politics between knowledge communities. That's essentially what these people who supposedly are interested in epistemic responsibilism are focused on. They're trying to work out, okay, well, what is the sort of the ideal politics between knowledge communities? And then they can sort of, almost empirically, they can sort of identify something that is a real phenomena, which is something approximating vulnerable narcissism. The thing that they don't seem to understand is that vulnerable narcissism is like a codependent kind of feature of a knowledge community, or of anything that it pertains to. Like, vulnerable narcissism is very much like a failed form of narcissism. Like, narcissism, like grandiose narcissism, let's say pure unadulterated narcissism, is a very turbulent psychological schema to actually perpetrate. You know, the highs are let's say are met with a potential low, and it's very hard to sustain grandiose narcissism because you're contending it into being constantly. What vulnerable narcissism tries to do is they try to actually defer accountability for their narcissism. They try to disguise it in some kind of orthodoxy, in some kind of environmental condition or something like that, and it basically it converts what would be in the grandiose narcissist this emotional sort of like manic height of grandiosity. It tries to convert that emotional state of sort of high status and importance, and it tries to do it in the intellectual realm instead. So it doesn't vulnerable narcissism doesn't contend let's say a robust emotional way of being. It's actually quite a corrosive, resentful, sort of mode of emotional engagement and such. But what it's really sort of where it's really getting its narcissism sort of off is in terms of the intellectual realm in which it's for the mere emotional cost. Essentially, it is able to essentially contend a conceit, an intellectual conceit, which is completely secured, because it says that its emotional state is rational, is in proportion with empirical things, and that there is a linear parallel between its emotional state and let's say some kind of intellectual filtering belief system or something like that, and environmental conditions. And so essentially it gets away from not having to contend epistemic responsibilism because it has like these meta concerns, this meta political emergency, that there's almost like a politics of necessity or of emergency or of a desperation that sort of railroads any kind of need for having internal consistency or something like that. I guess. Yeah, I've waded into this in a bit too of a sloppy sort of way of depicting this stuff. But anyway, the very pernicious thing about vulnerable narcissism is that it can only secure itself when it is in an ongoing drama, when the drama is persistent. And so what generally happens is that vulnerable narcissism will literally create the conditions that it is complaining about in its immediate environment. It will actually it will generate them because it is needed for the intellectual circuitry, so it's a self-agonizing, self-fulfilling prophecy, really. And I mean, you can also see how this works in identity politics, that essentially it creates perverse incentives really to generate and sustain and create new racism, because then it can continually use the same kind of retributivistic, reactionary sort of self-conception in terms of via the identity of how the system should be relating to the individual via that vehicle, which I think that the vulnerable narcissism belongs to the identity. And so then you can also have a kind of like an emotional shield against having to actually, when you do this on this political scale, when you follow this kind of conceptual outlook, it's almost like you're one step removed from the vulnerable narcissism, because you're doing it to some degree vicariously via the identity. And then you have these supposedly pseudo-intellectuals telling you about, how, yes, we need to use this as the political vehicle, as the social vehicle, because this is the way to sort of bring balance to the system. This is the one ring to rule them all. anyway, but the most stable way to secure vulnerable narcissism is to actually find a vulnerable narcissist on the other side in an out group. And then essentially you can just trade corrosive, you can sort of, you can both prop up each other's defensive reactive frameworks in a kind of, in an interlocked conflagration, and this is the kind of perpetual war that identity politics, the perpetual civil war that all totalitarian and fascistic regimes maintain. This is their narrative, and they require it as well because they never have to actually positively construct their identity. They can just say, no, we inherited it. We inherited this empirical situation, and they just say that it's a matter of fact, and that becomes the mythologized history. Which is very stupefying. It lends itself to a disgusting kind of infantilism of the citizenry, in which you never, once you basically debase the kind of the philosophical groundwork of liberalism, of political liberalism, where moral consideration is vested in the individual, but now you actually give this, you put the mark of the beast on the individual, and you say, no, you are conditioned, and actually you can't get away from your racial identity, you can't get away from your ethnic identity. These things are intrinsic, are essential, and it doesn't matter what excuse you give. They're essential because that's the way of the world. I don't know how crazy you have to be to sort of completely fuck up the non-racial political paradigm that we had, which was essentially destroyed by black plutocrats because it was a convenient ideological scapegoat to conceal their corruption. But thus is the way of the world. Thus is the way of totalitarians and their handmaidens, and war criminals in the making. Because the bandwagon is so exciting, I guess, because that's the excuse. Well, everyone else thought it was popular, so I just went along with it. Anyway, so if you, let's say empirically, that you actually have now this vulnerable narcissism between two communities, you call them, in the epistemic realm, knowledge communities, or just in pure sociological analysis and reduction, you want to say power structures between two different distinct communities. Now, if you actually want to directly try to fix that, right, if you want to sort of directly intervene on the basis that this is, that you're going to sort of reify this vulnerable narcissism, instead of recognizing that it's a kind of, I think that non-racialism is actually the best cure for all of this, because although you can say, well, it's unfair because it shouldn't exist. Well done. Things that shouldn't exist, in fact, do exist. The point is not that we just sort of teleport into the utopian future. It's that we actually have to build the world that we want to live in, right? And sort of this idea, well, how are you going to intervene and actually just teleport the utopia on top of these vulnerable narcissism that already exist? I think racialist dogma and racialist sentiments were really being eradicated. They were unpopular. You couldn't sort of use them out in the open, although people had beliefs. The young, the new generations, weren't being infected by it. And in fact, many people in the older generations, I think, would have actually completely turned around. But as soon as you impose racialist legislation, as soon as you really create as soon as you create this disgusting identity politics doctrine, you really invent new racism. The kind of bigotry which comes in the form of power plus privilege equals prejudice. So you get the power plus privilege equals prejudice bigots that say that, bigots that have that disgusting formulation of, it's just it's racialism. It's not. It's relativism in a nutshell. How can you say that is sine qua non? Relativism. How can there not be relativism? The idea that no, there's some kind of rationale that you can that will be able to substantiate that kind of nonsense, that kind of, and I mean, what's actually more disgusting is how they've crept that logic in, and they've tried to semantically derange the words themselves. Like, basically, no, it's not racism, because racism requires prejudice, and prejudice is defined by power and privilege. So, black plutocrats can't be racist. It's like they can't be racist against white people. Like it's just you can't be sexist if you don't have power and privilege. So I mean, so you are sort of using something about there's some kind of objective political sort of systemic reduction of between these different communities that is playing itself out, that has the systemic injustice. And that is a kind of overriding thing which individuals can represent, that sort of that out of body, top down purview of everything, and then represent that like ulterior justice which they are sort of advancing and advocating for, and producing some kind of activism towards. And this is really just the kind of the hook, the baited hook of the vulnerable narcissist that is projecting onto their environment in order to find a sympathetic relationship with a mirrored conflagration, or with its own position mirrored on the other side, so that it can stabilize its vulnerable narcissism in a locked down conflagration. And that is the kind of fascistic poisoned culture that we live in at the moment with identity politics. And its intellectual handmaidens trying to sow the fields of this disgusting betrayal of the South African Constitution. Which is unlawful, which the courts, if they were functioning, if they had their heads screwed on, I mean, this stuff, it's beyond sickening, to see this kind of this repurposed apartheid relativism. I mean, it's I mean, you can even see in some of the substantiations that they make and things like that, the kind of the confused. Anyway, I'm not going to go into that. It's too depressing. Okay, so I'm just trying to focus on some of this this intellectual stuff. So it's like they're complaining about the existence of this sort of like vulnerable narcissism complex, and then saying that there needs to be a special ad hoc sort of thing. Now, again, like as I said, it would be nice to wish these things away. You cannot. The actual solution to the problem really is to indirectly let's say de-escalate by indirectly only trying to facilitate the end of these sorts of things, indirectly working towards progress in the right direction. And actually at the same time we would have had much better outcomes if we had done that. But essentially to facilitate, let's say, the disguise of and the concealment of political accountability on black actors, essentially, this ideology is very convenient because it convolutes and conceals accountability in this racialist excuse factory, because essentially the racial egoism is the political football, which is the huge diversion. And the idea is, well, until we can get this racial egoism into some kind of parity or some kind of separate but equalness or something like that, Okay. There was another point around here that I wanted to raise. So I mean, this stuff is so toxic. So essentially, the idea is, this is the symmetry of their argument, is that the racist inheritance and the tragedy of the society is so great, and the ongoing suppression and oppression is so great against the racial egoism or some generalization or some community or something like that, that you have to use state power to try to equalize the unequal situation which persists. I need to formulate this more specifically. You have to use state power to directly impose redress of the consequences of a tragedy. I'm not actually, that isn't so problematic, but no. See, it's not about You see, all of this thing about redress is not really the problem. The problem is not redress, it's who is receiving the redress. Is it an individual that's receiving the redress? Or is it somehow the racial ego itself, as some kind of collective conceptual outline, Again, it's like, who does, for example, the epistemic injustice belong to? Who does the social injustice belong to? Does it belong to the ethnicity? Does it belong to the identity, or does it belong to specific individuals that will have specific cases and specific things? So it's this sort of obtuse treatment. But you see, when you try to sort of deliver it to this vague entity that's meant to sort of be the proxy for the individual, then you create this sort of this false economy, or this false set of criteria and conflate, and you end up sort of conflating things. By necessity, you have to conflate things. You have to impose stereotypes. You have to sort of create this false symmetry between these vague generalizations, and you end up fudging the perspective in order just to make the ideology function. But sorry, I wanted to say the thing about the anticipation thing again, because there is this thing in which the prescription anticipates a good outcome. And if the prescription doesn't deliver a good outcome, then it's not the prescription that was wrong, it's that the system is even more evil than we thought, and we need to have an even more radical prescription. It's this kind of expectation that it's likely that this ad hoc process is the deliverer. It's sort of, archetypally, I can only describe it as a false prophet. What else can be said about it? I need to sort of try, because I had a technical description of this, which I think was elucidating. Call it okay, so yes, it's just sloppy thinking in some sense, because it's like the proof that its process was sort of the positive outcome that comes from the prescription both vindicates, let's say, their moral authority to have made the prescription in the first place, and it's sort of and that is the evidence that the model that they used like that it's the evidence that there is systemic oppression, but essentially this is sort of technically it's like a gamble, it's like a Ponzi scheme essentially. And because it sort of has this innate, unfinished, incomplete, kind of conceptual outline, and it's all sort of comes at the end of the process. This idea that there's going to be this kind of this sort of this advent in which like, okay, well, now we know that we've done enough of it, or sort of now that it's sort of all coalesced. I wanted to talk about this from a technical point of view, in terms of, what was it? I found a good insight into this technical lopsidedness. I guess it's sort of it all comes. It's all hinged on that. Yeah, I think almost a good way to understand this form of, let's say, cherry-picked relativism, because it doesn't, like, it's relativism. It can say that no, we're not that kind of relativist. We are not a relativist, because it could actually be any one of a number of relativisms, which we're not going to specify because we don't need to, because we didn't start the fire. It's that kind of, just get with the program because we didn't start the fire. And that's essentially what they just keep on table thumping. It's like, can't you empirically see the fire is burning and we didn't start it? Like, that's essentially their point of departure. They start in the middle of the story, and they don't take epistemic responsibility for updating their narrative. Their narrative just needs to be good enough to support their kind of emotional, reactionary, sort of temperament. What is the other thing that I should say on this? Because there was a slightly more elaborated thing when I was thinking about this, and now I'm not able to locate it that well. But yeah, it was this issue of the vulnerable narcissism. So this whole thing essentially, you can only know that you've imposed the right ad hoc intervention between these communities that have, let's say, this fixed vulnerable narcissism. I mean, the truth is that the only way to actually get rid of it is to pretend that it isn't real, and that it is insane, and that it is irrational, because it is all those things as well. And if you just have free contract and open commerce, and you don't impose arbitrary mandates and restrictions, like, you actually really make progress on it. As soon as you sort of add to the conflagration, it just metastasizes. Because essentially it's built on projecting things onto its environment, and then it has its kind of confirmation bias reflected back to it. But in as much as there are these tendencies, there are always individuals that have this vulnerable narcissism. I mean, society is a very diverse mix of people, and whatever arbitrary group you have, if it is an arbitrary group based on race or gender, there will be people who will be vulnerable narcissists. And there will be people who will have had bad experiences with vulnerable narcissists, perhaps with their parents and things like that, and they will have developed, let's say, the antidote, and they will be a breath of fresh air. And eventually, as long as you have a clean culture, in terms of like a clean political culture, eventually these people actually rise to prominent positions, and they're able to essentially create a cultural hegemony of values that suppress disgusting, vile, attitudes and sentiments and things like that. And we were on the way to doing that in the 90s, but then we get a disgusting sort of people who like to tap into the wellspring of racial egoism and for convenient, or perhaps they even intellectually, it's good enough for them, you know. Anyway, there's no point in sort of talking about the depressing political landscape. I mean, what to me is actually much more depressing is someone like Musi Maimane, who essentially just completely flip-flops on principle and just throws his hat in to be a candidate Führer, that he will promote the interests of the racial egoism, that he will guard the identity, and he will be an arbiter over the identities of the people that belong to his rainbow nation. You know, like that was kind of his campaign, was kind of the subtext of his campaign. You know, it's thank goodness he's gone, but I wonder if the DA can even purge itself, because vulnerable narcissism is something that only operates when there is an orthodoxy that can conceal it. It only operates on the level to which it exists in our current political climate. I mean, you know, you've got professors who are supposed to be intellectual people that line up to help this bandwagon make its way across the lurching towards Bethlehem, or whatever you want to call it. I mean, sorry to use eschatological poetry or whatever, but I mean, to me, this is such a depraved and depressing betrayal and degradation of a moral devolution that is just, you think you live in the new South Africa, and you wake up and you're actually living in Weimar, Germany. You know, it's sort of after just having defeated apartheid and coming up with the moral distilled solution, and then for people essentially to just allow themselves to be swept up in this hysteria and to be taken over by this vulnerable narcissism. I mean, and that has been facilitated by the intellectual, what do you call it, the intellectual veneer that has been supplied by people who have these fancy titles and these credentials, because they're not willing to actually look at the substance and the consistency, because it's too much to say that some pseudo-intellectual who wants to pontificate about race theory, it's too much to say this is junk, this is moral junk, it's based on sociological reductions. It's embarrassing. It's embarrassing, that you can call yourself an intellectual. If you had, I mean, in fact, there is very difference between those sorts of people and people who consider themselves pseudo-intellectuals in the Ku Klux Klan. Like if you were in a different culture, if you were born a different color, that would have just been your world. That would have just been, it just would have manifested as that kind of bullshit. It's just that, but it flies under the radar because of this disgusting double standard. Because what is it all based on? Power plus privilege equals prejudice. So it's not prejudiced if you supposedly don't have power and privilege, but somehow these people get academic money to promulgate this anti-unconstitutional tripe. Anyway, there's no point in me pontificating emotionally while I'm trying to explore this. But anyway, I wonder if that is even a new contribution. I wonder if I should add this into one great recording. I mean, this last 40 minutes maybe is too much of a kind of addendum, but perhaps it helps to illustrate something slightly more. But you see, I was trying to... I didn't want to get into more technical details about, well, if these communities have these things, how you would actually end up treating it, how you would end up sort of how the state could do things about it, but not, let's say, directly, only indirectly, or how they wouldn't be able to essentially corrupt the rule of law in order to try to, let's say, pierce the veil and sort of, because you see, you cannot judge people for how they, let's say, orchestrate their their personal view and their personal opinion in terms of their epistemic agency. You cannot demand people have a particular epistemic agency. You can demand that they constrain their behavior in. You can create behaviors that you can say are that you use non-racialist criteria to describe, that are like that you can define in general principles as being prejudiced. You can make those behaviors wrong, but you can't define thought crime. You can't impose thought crime, against people's epistemic agency. That it's retarded. I mean, it's literally, how illiberal and totalitarian can you be? And it also already assumes that you hold the moral high ground. It also assumes that there's that the true answer objectively and its exterior, and where are you standing from, or to adjudicate this about your own thoughts? This sort of shit is contended by people that cannot actually persuade, that cannot convince, that cannot do anything, and that they require an orthodoxy and a dogma to back them up. And but I mean, thus and this has many different manifestations. Where essentially, it's one thing to have a separate argument or discussion while you're having a primary discussion. You have a secondary discussion about context or about semantics or about language or about some other sort of meta concern, which is perhaps even quite vital, but it is somewhat tangential to some degree, but it is something that has to almost be cleared up a priori to the rest of the argument, or to the primary or main argument. It's like a secondary issue, okay, well, we can't just talk about politics. We also have to sort of get to grips with the metaphysical, sort of difference or gap between us, or something like that. That you have these sort of other issues, and so much of that kind of contention is just sort of negated on such an abject level, on such a puerile level, just in order to maintain this very unwieldy kind of relativism which is being perpetrated and concealed and convoluted by projecting onto its scapegoat, its ideological scapegoat. Now, you see, I guess what I'm describing now is a polemic, because I can't actually because I can't tell you where they have invested. I can't tell you for certain where they have invested moral consideration, but I know for damn sure it's been divested from the individual. I don't know where they have taken that divested moral consideration and where they have placed it. I don't know where, they've just stolen it. It's gone far away. And they are sort of, and maybe they'll sort of insinuate, no, it's both. It belongs to the ethnicity and it belongs to the individual. So we can just sort of give these people the mark of the beast. Every individual comes pre-programmed, with this ethnicity label, these labels, we can't forget them. Please put out your forearm, get ready for your tattoo. That's the kind of, that's the actual thrust of their intellectual position, where they sort of conflate relativism with a kind of empirical semantic, sort of way to ground their position. And I guess, as long as they don't actually do that, as long as they don't actually decide how they're going to do that, but they just, they continue with their project, their ad hoc project anyway, and then they never have to answer that question, but sadly the fascists will answer it for them, because they are just making the way straight for the fascists. They are the useful idiots. They are the kind of the intellectual gaggle that sort of creates the cover, the right sort of confused intellectual cover for the actual fascists. And I mean, technically I think you should just think of them as useful idiots or proto-fascist. because, in their sophisticated thing, they still think that it can all work out, that you can have a kind of rainbow Hitler. But, the actual function of their policy is so unwieldy, is so positivistic, that it can only serve one master. There are going to be, if this is going to be how you control society from a Führer type principle, something that is allowed to look at the system from nowhere, from beyond it, it's going to require a kind of mythological orthodoxy that everyone has to pervasively have imprinted on the inside of their skull. They all have to be equally tethered to the same sort of cloud ideology. They all have to belong to this cloud religion, and if they break ranks, then they must be crushed. The nail that sticks up must be banged down. And they will use all manner of, even Gestapo, but emotional blackmail, intellectual jerry-rigging, optics, the very staged kind of arguments, in which they highly edit things and take things out of context, because the ideology is so exacting. It has such fragile needs in order to perpetuate itself. You really have to cherry pick the data tremendously and have this weird kind of selective referencing system. You have to filter reality to such a high degree to make their ideology pertinent. You really have to ignore so much good faith and project so much bad faith in order to keep their their formulation relevant and pristine and beyond reproach. You really have to create an echo chamber, which you can see much evidence thereof, and essentially they just get the dullards to sing in chorus with themselves, and then they can hear very clearly when someone is breaking the chorus. Their ears are very sensitive there, and they're very keen to being prickled by the notes of dissonance, because of how fragile and unsound and unreasonable their whole philosophical schema is. But the fascists are very keen to have excuses to enforce this orthodoxy. And so, let's say more ruthless and cruder intellectuals than them will come to eventually fill their boots, because, although I think that the useful idiots are as morally reprehensible as the fascists themselves, the fascists also eventually grow tired of them and remove them. That's what Hitler said about the useful idiots. But anyway, I went into this theme a long time ago when I tried to sort of describe the difference between kind of the fascistic pack mentality of the breeds of, they see people as like breeds of dogs, that they belong to their ethnicity, they belong to their breed. But then the proto-fascists are kind of like, they believe in a kind of like a multicultural ethnicity or something like that, but that you need to find some kind of arbitration between the groups, and so they see themselves as intellectually kind of part of that coordinating class, part of that kind of the totalitarian brain machine, the kind of that's going to administer everything. Anyway, I'm not going to get into that tangent. That is a slightly different kettle of fish. Getting into that metaphor is useful in some political ways, but not in the pure intellectual, philosophical thing. But anyway, I'm going to finish this recording now. I was just listening to my last recording, which will be the first part of this file that I upload. So it'll be sort of quite near the beginning, and I just remember thinking that I want to sort of hyper focus on this one issue, which I'm not sure if I elaborated it later on, but anyway, this will be a point of emphasis if it's not missing. Because I think that the point about the hypothetical damage to epistemic injustice, or that is monitored by the epistemic injustice, or that the epistemic injustice is pertaining to, the reason why I call it hypothetical damage, and I do think that that is a much technically clearer way of understanding how at least this conceptual device and machine is working, and it's primarily working in order to facilitate a kind of epistemic reactionism. I think that is quite a clear um, um, process that I have, I think, shed some light on at least. But anyway, so the reason why I call the damage in terms of the epistemic injustice hypothetical is because how is it being calculated? You know, this is the biggest question. That it's this unknown quantity that you've proven in some vague principle, you've proven that it is likely to exist, that the quality of it is inherent and inherited, perhaps. Like, I'm willing to concede that there has been perpetrated some kind of epistemic injustice, but the idea that it can be quantified, that is completely hypothetical. So this is the point that I'm going to elaborate this now, because how can that hypothetical damage, or if it is not hypothetical, how are you calculating it? How does it, and who does it belong to? Who is experiencing it? You know, like, and this is the thing, is that, like, it's not being experienced by an individual. It's obviously not being experienced by an individual. It's being experienced vicariously by some individual who is tapping into some kind of identitarian, ethnocentric relativism, or some kind of ethnic lived experience, or something like that, some kind of racial, spiritual kind of esoteric, it's very much like the kind of the Nazi culture, blood and soil. Just now this is with, history attached to it, or something like that. But I mean, so just to go back to my concession, so let's just track where let's say, the obvious point of the epistemic injustice, that we can obviously imagine that it was very, very likely to have, and probably did happen to many people in history who bore, let's say, this damage against their epistemic agency. And if this epistemic injustice has been experienced by people who are no longer with us, I claim this is fundamentally now, in the present, hypothetical, because we have to ask the question: who is experiencing it? There's no one alive experiencing it. So how can we ever ascertain the extent of the damage? So, and this kind of, so I'm technically claiming that it must be hypothetical. And if it is hypothetical, how can it ever be so I do think that these technical challenges are effectively, or somewhat concealed and convoluted in the process that I sort of describe technically as the kind of, as this seeing themselves in the middle of this story in progress of this vulnerable narcissism, and then trying to, or anyway, but okay, that's going to confuse it a bit too much. Let me say that rather what they're trying to do is this kind of technical problem is, let's say, overshadowed if they can prescribe a process and then have a particular anticipation on that process, and when that outcome occurs and it sort of and it complies with their anticipation, then, let's say, the gamble pays off. because then we know that effectively we have undone the epistemicide, we have recovered the damage. Now, because that damage is no longer being associated with people's actual epistemic agency, you're actually recovering a kind of vicarious epistemic injustice, which I think as soon as you try to bridge that gap between, well, how can you actually vicariously gain something by sort of rehabilitating a kind of a phantom epistemic agency or something like that, like how what is the conduit or something like that, or how are you summoning the redress, or like how are you projecting the redress to the actual epistemic agent that actually received the epistemic injustice. You have to set out a kind of a pervasive orthodox morality in which this kind of vicarious experiencing becomes necessary. And so essentially this is what identity consciousness is. This is what this new racialist monster is. This re-emergence of Nazi philosophy, basically, that has been reborn within the most ironic of contexts, within the new South Africa. It has taken root. Never mind that we have a non-racialist constitution and such. Okay, let me try and neaten this up, but I think I have laid it out now, but let me just try and neaten this up to some extent. So this ends up necessitating a toxic form and a poisonous form of self-identification in order to facilitate this process. So it's very interesting because there's a whole lot of sort of emotional codependency, and what essentially accumulates into and aggregates into a functioning vulnerable narcissism, in which essentially you don't actually have to know what it is that you're doing. You don't have to have a clear epistemic sense of yourself, because somehow it's just outsourced to this political collective entity in which politics and sociology and ethnicity are just sort of all conflated into a kind of a single quantity, which is how the only way that then you can reclaim the epistemic injustice is by having this conflation, by having the sociological reduction, which doesn't even have to be that clear at defining itself. I mean, and if you want to do this in a very intellectually clean way, and when I say clean, I mean it's not even, but the cleanest way. If you want to do this in the cleanest way possible, what you actually do is you put this hypothetical problem, you put it all on the scapegoat, you put it all on the oppressor. So it's like the epistemic injustice cannot be seen as being redressed in terms of the epistemic agents that experienced it, who are no longer with us, who are no longer experiencing it. So if the epistemic injustice is no longer being experienced, how can it ever be retraced and rediscovered, let's just say, and reestablished or something like that? The only way that you can imagine it to be reestablished is if you do something to, let's say, the thing that does continue to exist, which is what you're projecting onto it as well, is the cause of the epistemic injustice. So you have to identify the cause of the epistemic injustice, and you have to say, no, you have to contract yourself. You have to sort of change your mode in some quantifiable way. And then whatever disruption and or retributivism that you absorb, right? Whatever revenge is done to you in the name of this process, as long as we can qualify that at the end of the process, that like you have sort of improved your quality, your moral quality in some sense, the difference between, let's say, before the process and after the process is proof that the epistemic injustice has been redressed or something like that. I mean, the problem is that because it's being done in such a kind of a conceptually, analytically in such a fudged way is all I can sort of describe it. Because it depends on the necessity of being able to conflate these things, which fundamentally, you can never set up principles as to how these things can slot in, how these things can be translated one for the other um, it really is a kind of a creed that necessitates a kind of relativistic um, outlook. And so if you want to not have the relativism on your side, you just basically say, no, 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 it's because it's a social empirical fact that we are host, that our society, our civilization, our culture, whatever, is host to relativism. That's just a kind of a base empirical fact that is just sort of claimed and thumbsucked from a kind of sociological reduction. And so you end up effectively making sociology the king of philosophy. You end up saying, actually, there's no such thing as philosophy. It all falls in under a kind of sociological matrix or something like that. And that, philosophy is a subset of sociology and not the other way around. So I mean, that is, I link this to, sorry, I've got me ranting about this sort of stuff, but I mean, I link this to what is the phrase? Social constructivism. No, it's called post-structuralism. Yeah, I mean, many people, I think, when they just look at post-structuralism by itself, they know that it has philosophical problems, and it has even been supposedly criticized by many of these people who are into identity politics, because they know that it's corrosive to the kind of retributivistic, because if you sort of are forced to intellectualize things to this degree, it doesn't quite support their use of relativism. So I think that's why they're actually unsettled with it, is because they need to disguise their relativism better. They need to guard it better. They need to give it more kind of intellectual credibility. They need more cover for their pseudo-intellectualism than post-structuralism will provide. But functionally, they are all post-structuralists. Functionally, that movement essentially is their intellectual movement. They're just trying to find a kind of a better formulation of it, which will eventually come in what I have already outlined as the Führer principle, which culturally already is manifested within these political movements. They already intuitively, emotionally, subtextually, they already know that they're already operating from the Führer principle that has yet to be uttered. It has yet to be fully formulated, and that's what they're sort of groping for at the moment, is the sort of the post hoc sort of justification of these sorts of emotional arguments. But I mean, you can see the writing on the wall. You can see that they have to deal, the test of if they've actually found the correct formulation or not is when they write something up and they say, like, the pale male perspective, and hegemony or whatever has this kind of thing. We need to be able to identify that. Like, that's one of the things, is that if whatever formulation they have, whatever epistemological structure they use, isn't able to, like, actually resonate and deal with that and dismantle that, then it's like it fails their test. So they have to be sensitive and responsive, or should I say rather, they have to be primed and justified and excused in their reactionary sort of mechanical interface. And thus their moral certitude is, like, environmentally excused. They have been able to pass the buck, and essentially just all rests on the scapegoat, while they can continue to hysterically generate the kind of propaganda needed to animate this very brittle and hyperbolic, hysterical sort of cherry-picked narrative that can insulate. And I must say, like, because I don't make all the appropriate apologies when I sort of deal with this sort of topic, but let me just say, from a purely humanitarian stance, it is disgusting the kind of attention that this side issue has received. This ulterior process or whatever has provided the excuse for politicians to be corrupt. It really has. It creates a huge economy, a political economy of diversion away from the practical challenges of development. It has allowed a black plutocracy to take over a country and to destroy the structure of law and legality in order to facilitate even more of their administrative Napoleonic corruption of the state, where essentially the executive is seen as this provider of a kind of moral, this moral compass in terms of trying to rehabilitate this racial egoism, which and that whole, let's say, political theme, which is facilitated by this kind of pseudo-intellectualism, means that effectively you can overlook the fact that there's so much social injustice, which is actually facilitating the sabotage of the economy, the sabotage of growth, the sabotage of so many institutional functions. That essentially, when you use race as a proxy, when you use identity as a proxy, and you don't create non-racialist criteria for special treatment by government policy, then you can't even judge the policy correctly, because the policy is judged by how much disruption it brings, and disruption is good, not by actual metrics. You say that a policy is good because it's dismantling white monopoly capital, not because it's actually taking people out of poverty. It completely shifts the goalposts to a kind of cannibalism and retributivist, sort of revenge and vengeance, a politics of that, rather than a politics of actually using opportunity and resources that are available and making the best plan and doing that. You're just completely diverted from actually looking at effective policy, because the actual goal of effectiveness is completely clouded by this revenge, which means that, if you just make the statistic look better, you see, you can engineer equality not by raising up people from poverty, but by bringing people down. And in the process of bringing people down, when you redistribute that wealth, let's just say, that gets concentrated in the hands of a few black plutocrats, that also facilitate. I mean, you can say that that's not the ideal way that the ideology would function, but it's invisible. The point is that it's made invisible, because the ideology is not sensitive to that, because it's not sensitive to pragmatism, because it's sensitive to these other ulterior. Because it by its function, it conflates these properties. It conflates the quantity of this vicarious identities, because the identity is disadvantaged. The identity is vested with a moral consideration, not the individual. You have tried to generalize epistemic injustice away from the individual, and you've created a device, a monster, to be used crudely. And facilitate. This moral corruption is what has facilitated the state corruption. This is the ideology of state corruption. It's also the ideology of all tin pot authoritarian backwaters. You have an in-group, you have an out-group, you have a scapegoat, and you're selling protection to your people. You're selling a kind of ideological protection to your people, which is cheap while you steal their money. That's what we have because of these sorts of pseudo-intellectuals. Pontificating about their outline and gambling essentially with things that they can't ground in reason. And if you don't vindicate their prescriptions in the outcome of following their prescription, then they just sort of double down, and instead of ever looking at their own structure, which is unsound and unreasoned, and not fully borne out and not not established from first principles. And what is it trying to conserve? What is it trying to save? I mean, it's just basically saying this is a very useful, simplifying, stultifying, stupefying movement. And it's so exciting to be a part of it, because if we just all get in with the program, then we'll be able to have a single power that will be able to rule over all of us and sort of administer from the top down. And that is the fastest, it's like this hypothetical that would be the fastest way of doing it. And it's a moral imperative. So you've sort of got this weird kind of conflation between this kind of, this simple moral device mechanism is like, the wishful thinking that it'll also be practically expedient. It's kind of like it's a weird kind of politics of expediency or ideology of expediency, which, if you actually look at it at all in terms of empirical data, in terms of, okay, well, never mind what your actual conceptual outlook predicts about yourself. Like, let's just, if we use any measures that you tend to suggest, like if the outcome never works, oh well, it's just because that the system is actually so much more corrupt and insidious than we thought it was. It just ends up projecting more onto the relativism that it's supposedly antagonistic against. Because, well, this is the nature of vulnerable narcissism, is that it secures its own ideological outlook at all costs. It preserves its own intellectual integrity at all costs, even at the expense of its own emotional well-being. So it will say, yes, I'm in a hysterical state, so don't challenge me intellectually. Don't threaten the schema, because that's all I have, essentially. And then you're just left with this hollow identity consciousness, and then you have to be a part of some kind of mob and go burning something down or something like that. You have to be part of this collective ritualistic sort of thing, and you'll end up, approximating Nazi society and with its weird kind of religious ritualistic sort of things, because you have now transformed epistemic agency into this conflated, convoluted, sort of destiny religion or something like that, with this orthodox mythology of history, which is constantly being excavated by the collective, sort of in some kind of simulated way or something like that. And you've got these special people that come in and out who are the enforcers of this perpetual civil war and perpetual revolution. Nazi philosophy rehashed. It would be nice if more people could create an intellectual polemic and actually bring the fight to them, because they are destroying South Africa. They have done a lot of damage, but if we can't start to clear up the intellectual side of it, I don't think there's going to be not going to be able to gain the footing of being able to turn the tide from the fascistic doom spiral, essentially. I mean, I've just thought now of another sort of standalone issue that can sort of, I think, thematically explain quite a bit. So it's interesting that, for example, the pale male perspective, however you want to sort of caricaturize it, which is effectively a kind of stereotype, but it's meant to sort of symbolize systemic oppression, basically. Now, this is interesting because, I mean, I would argue that there's at least a historical conflation going on here, because how you can describe Western societies as oppressive is frankly insane. You have to say, historically, they were oppressive, and that somehow they continue to be. So already, it's like, where is this being experienced? How is it being experienced? It's sort of in this very strange conflated paradigm of how the word how is being interchangeable with history. So how is it being experienced? Is that it's not that merely it was experienced, but it is what was experienced is still being experienced. Now, this is something that, I would argue that actually has to be actually argued for philosophically. You can't just thumbsuck that empirically and say that, oh, I suppose that it's still happening, or oh, well, because we know that that it was experienced, and because we know that, we're just going to sort of assume some level of temporal determinism or something like that, that it's going to sort of have a systemic effect from history. So it's weird that the systemic oppression is fundamentally historical. So you can almost, but anyway, but how you sort of vest that historical oppression in let's say the modern day caricature of the pale male, or whatever you want to call it, You know, that I think is unjustifiable. I mean, that is obviously bigoted. You know, in the old definition of racism before these people completely eviscerated language and semantics to suit their very strange kind of philosophical, you know, to get around the resistance that they would otherwise meet, I guess, by just sort of having to invent their own terms of their crazy, you know, they've had to try to disguise it and say, no, no, it's just, you know, we just need to reinterpret language because this is what things should actually mean, you know, because they get to decide what things should actually mean. They don't have to argue and persuade for it. They can just sort of take over by, you know, trying to show that they've got enough moral authority, or let's say special, um, you know, that they should own the dictionary, you know, basically. Um, and you know, if you say, well, actually, that word doesn't mean that, like it's you haven't actually managed to change the dictionary yet, then they say, oh, well, the dictionary is part of the systemic oppression. I guess you know that's anything that doesn't agree with them is just part of the systemic oppression. Um, okay, so what was the standalone sort of thing? But yeah, okay. Now I was just talking about almost from their relative perspective. The thread that I'm trying to underline here is that, like, when you caricature this pale male perspective, you end up conflating all these things, right? In, you end in terms of how you are defining or calibrating or being able to monitor the systemic oppression that was experienced into the current system and all those things. So I'm just trying to clean up this issue of like what is actually being experienced in the present, right? Now, obviously, according to their framework, they've got their convoluted conflation between history and now, which they can sort of they can say, well, it's because of the pale male experience. But I would say that no, no, no. Let's actually just look at this pale male or whatever system or whatever you want to characterize the current system as being, and saying, well, what actually is its character? You know, like what even is its racial makeup? You know, and you know, there. I mean, I think that yeah, if you actually sort of have an unideologically filter of this thing, and you sort of have a bearing, if you look at the economic growth that the country has experienced in total, if you look at the kind of the brain drain that we've had in South Africa, for instance, I mean, if you actually just look at things honestly, historically, you can get a very very different picture. You know, if you don't sort of ideologically cherry pick these kinds of statistics of wealth and things like that, which are also very dubious in terms of how some of these statistics have been orchestrated in order to facilitate this disgusting polemic of this racial ethnocentric, you know, sort of thing. But and also if you look at how wealth has been concentrated in certain black plutocrats and stuff like that. And the drain that that's had on the capacity of the system to grow and provide more opportunity for people, and also how education, yeah, I mean, if you look at how much things are paid for, but how badly it's delivered, you know, like where does the accountability for this really rest? I don't think it rests with the pale male, except if you want to say that, you know, black people have absolutely no agency. In which case, I guess you're arguing that when apartheid wanted to end itself, it shouldn't have actually become a democracy. It should have continued on to perpetrate its rehabilitative function, since that's what you are expecting now in this moral landscape, is that essentially um, the pale male has all the accountability, but it has none of the control. So they're on the hook for things that they're not actually administering. Um, you know, so you've got this weird kind of unaccountable uh, uh, pseudo agency of black people, which is sort of baked into the ideological outlook, which is also quite disgusting, um, and confused, uh, fundamentally diversionary. Okay, but anyway, what I was going to say is that probably the worst, most corrosive and poisonous aspect is that what gets conflated as systemic oppression is like, let's just say, the cost of culture itself. That different cultures have different sociological properties, perhaps, or something like that. And that in any hierarchy of competence and hierarchy of value, there are going to be trade-offs. There are going to be, you actually have to have structures. If you don't have structures, you don't facilitate coordination. You don't facilitate coordination, you can't reach the same level of wealth. You have to have conventions. Uh, um, you have to have commonly held beliefs, even if they are, let's say, imprecise or inaccurate or wrong. You can't expect two people to come across each other and to sort of see each other as completely new alien creatures, and then they sort of take months to sort of like work out how to communicate between one another. You end up like wasting too much time. You start at a position, you start with, you could even call it prejudice. It doesn't matter. As long as, let's say, there's enough value fluidity in which people are able to change their notions, and they're able to update from their starting conventional projections, whatever you want to call it. So there is a politics of communication to some degree, sorry, rather, there is an economics of communication. And as long as people aren't, let's say, concretely confining people into boxes and labels and things like that, which is ironically what this kind of decolonialization solution tries to do. It tries to impose certain mandates and quotas and a kind of pervasive morality which is supposed to sort of infiltrate people's skulls. And yes, I'll agree that some people have very toxic, bad ways of conceiving of things and conceptualizing things. But you don't change that by imposing certain things. I mean, I guess you could say, oh, we're just fed up anyway, we don't care, just genocide them or something like that. Just get rid of the racist white people, we don't give a damn. I mean, I think that's also a very sort of pessimistic view of just the scale. You're sort of projecting a sort of the scale of a racist scourge, which I don't even think empirically bears out. Just because you have a negative experience of someone doesn't mean that it's racism. There are many people who are, let's say, psychologically fucked up in many different ways that have nothing to do with racism. People are difficult, sort of as part of the human condition to some degree. But anyway, okay, these are all some little bit tangents. But the conflation of all of this, well, if anything bad is happening to me, it's because of my identity, and it's because I'm not a pale male or something like that. As if yeah, okay, I'm not just trying to calculate this on the negative side. I'm trying to sketch out that there are positive structures within what you might call the pale male patriarchy that perhaps are the most efficient or effective kind of compromises that have to be made in order to create a structure. And if you can forego anything, but then you're going to forego, let's say, the efficacy of wealth that it generates. So everything has, let's say, a real cost, and you can't just sort of ideologically say, well, because I'm going to associate some structure to some kind of historical injustice, when I destroy that structure, which to me represents historical injustice, that I'm conflating with historical injustice, that somehow that's going to mean that now everyone will be able to have the same high status according to that structure which I've just blown up. There's a level at which you're conflating some kind of moral purchase that your conceptual outline professes to depict and to have, with a pragmatic sort of parallel projection. This idea that the oppression was containing and constraining, let's say, this like ulterior wealth, which again I think is being hypothetically calculated according to some very cherry-picked, sort of ideological filtering, some kind of internal compartmentalization, and essentially this becomes the job of the ad hoc administrator that has to kind of, the manager that actually gets put in charge when this kind of revolution and this kind of radical stuff happens. And then when that manager is not able to deliver, then they basically just start telling everyone about how the systemic oppression is worse than everyone thought. It's more insidious, and then it just doubles down on itself because it never fails. It never actually is wrong. It never foregoes its self righteousness. It never actually develops self um, self reflection. It never invigilates its own responsibility because it's just stuck in the middle of this story. Uh, and then it says, I didn't start the fire and I'm allowed to be reactionary. And this is the form that the South African state has ideologically adopted in order to conceal its own vast corruption and inefficiency, and it's also facilitated it to aggregate even more power because it's the idea is that the state power is going to sort of be a balancing force against like the private white power or something like that. And the problem also with this idea of government-led development, is that it's done by mandate. It's done in a way that actually destroys commerce. It destroys contract. It destroys coordination. Um, and then, if anything positive ever happens, it's because the government mandated it to do so. So, it has this very sort of weird thing where it's sort of the government sort of externalizes and privatizes its failings, and it sort of socializes or claims that the government is responsible for anything mildly positive that happens, although there's very little that actually happens that is positive, because the policy, the ideology behind it is such disgusting rubbish. I mean, the Nazis couldn't even get anything done without going to steal from some foreign nation. That's actually what sort of precipitated the sort of Poland and such. But okay, well, anyway, the point essentially here is that this idea of conflating all these things into a negative oppression, and maybe I've made this claim in separate recordings before, talking about capitalism, that essentially the problem with these radicals and supposed revolutionaries is they don't realize how much water capitalism is actually carrying for them. There are many things within the human condition which capitalism is actually allowing to be mitigated, allowing to be facilitated in a way in which that the crude expression of these things would otherwise be potentially quite negative in many contexts, which capitalism ameliorates. Like capitalism has this naturally sort of universalizing sort of it takes conflict or competition, and it sort of like it normalizes it to such a degree, and it universalizes it to such a degree that people can be sensitive to patterns, and so essentially it actually allows the focus of the culture, or it allows people that are part of a culture within a capitalistic society to sort of, it communicates to the collective, as it were. It communicates to the culture that is hosting it. And, it has given humanity somewhat of a defense against being taken over, not in every case and every time, but it is a kind of cultural technology to some degree. I mean, if you can just imagine, I mean, like life hundreds of years ago was absolutely awful. Um, you know, in folklore and things like that, and in little backwaters and things like that, the kind of power that people had in those small communities, and feudalism was actually very, okay, sorry, this is a bit of a disparate sort of topic, but um, feudalism was a huge upgrade from what happened before feudalism. You really didn't want to be, let's say, prone to being victimized by whatever crazy, what's the word, metaphysical speculation of one of your neighbors or something like that, or what is the thing called? Like fairy stories and things like that, and because okay, no, this is too, okay, no, I'm just going to jettison that. I mean, sorry, I'm not articulating that well, but that's what I'm trying to say is that you don't want people to be locally in control of their culture too much. I mean, people, I think, are actually in control of their culture to a high degree. They just don't have the sophistication to actually move it. That, like, some people are stronger than others. Some people have different talents and skills or whatever, and it requires a certain level of awareness to be able to sort of transcend and to, let's say, project your will through the medium of these things. And people that don't have the ability to do that, it's probably good that they aren't given a kind of ad hoc way of enforcing their will and trying to imprint people with their point of view. And let's say in earlier times before capitalism, you were really at the mercy of your local druid or your local, whatever. It's only when you sort of collectivize and standardize these things to some degree, that the individual can actually safely conduct their affairs and interface with culture and be a participant in like, let's say, the within the medium of a liberty which is empowering and gives them a purview and a place and a position, which I do think is hugely under threat by this ideology that essentially empowers some kind of collective ethnocentric identity or something like that, because then everyone can be put to shame relative to promoting the interests of the identity. It really is a disgusting creed that is not African. It's it's probably European in some historical origin or something like that. It's, well, I mean, I don't, referencing fascism, but like, these things are perennial. They exist within humanity because they are part of, let's say, you can call it the collective unconscious, I guess. But we all have recourse to the same angels and demons. But okay, now I'm digressing a bit too much. But these ideological artifices have obviously existed perennially. I mean, if you look at the sort of Babylonian kind of conception of their political entities. Anyway, okay. My main point is just to draw back. The main thing is that privilege itself, or whatever stereotype you're going to use to try and pin it into and invoke it into the present context, and sort of summon it so that it can absorb the brunt of your accountability or something like that, and excuse your own reactionary moral artifice. What happens when you sort of vilify privilege and when you create it as this effigy of an epistemic injustice is that what you throw away in that bathwater is the positive aspects of epistemic agency. Is essentially you're making it impossible to access epistemic agency until you go through some kind of ad hoc process, which the problem is that you don't even know when that process is finished, because how do you know when you give yourself over to this process, that the privilege has been banished. Like, how do you know that you've actually arrived there? Because you don't have a philosophical test. You've got this conflated empirical sort of thumbsuck sort of thing, and who's going to be the determinant of that? You basically have a zombie culture. You have a zombie political thing. You've just completely consigned yourself over to this process, which can't even actually know when it's finished, because the whole thing is a sort of a gamble. That the only reason why you did it, why you gave yourself over to the process, was to prove that the process needed to be done as well, because it's technically hypothetical. Okay, so now I'm sort of outlining these things, which I feel like this is the only thing I can do is sort of, I understand how I'm not making. It's impossible to pin down this ideology, so you can just sort of like try to picture it and describe how it functions, but like you can't ground it because it isn't sound to begin with. So it's very hard to, because you're going to say, oh well, you're not talking about this ideology, you're talking about your projection of it or something like that. Sadly, you are forced to project it because it is functionally, it's incomplete. Conceptually it's incomplete. And so functionally, whatever process that you use to depict it is going to, I don't know, but perhaps there is a way of formalizing some of the things that I've gone over in order to show all the different angles of perniciousness and that it orchestrates, and that it conceals, and how it sort of offloads that onto its scapegoat. Yeah, so I'm not remembering this one point that clearly, sadly, but I do just want to neaten up a point that I just made about capitalism carrying a lot of water for these supposed revolutionaries. Sort of elaborate that at least a little bit. See, the thing that totalitarian cultures offer to people essentially is a way to make the culture safe, or to secure the culture against some evil, some scapegoat, or something like that. And so you sort of you're nationalizing or socializing, or having a state socialism. And this is also perhaps what makes fascism, well, I mean, yeah, I was going to say state socialism or Leninism versus fascism, although they both did this, although the one did it openly and the other one did it, like, let's say, in a more concealed, or like in a more substantiated way. Like the USSR was like, no, we have to teach people class consciousness because it's a moral imperative that they are armed against the enemy, whereas the fascists essentially say we have to take over culture, I guess subtextually, because we need to guard ourselves against the Jewish conspiracy or whatever, against our foes or our outsiders, but also because we need to sort of, it's not just a mere defensive thing, it's because our culture has value and is good and is great or whatever. The problem is that as soon as you inculcate it in that kind of medium of the state, it's like it doesn't belong to the individual anymore. It has to be sort of administered on behalf of the individual, or on behalf of the group, by the state. And so you have this like issue of representation, essentially, that who is a valid representative, and so you kind of, again, it mirrors what happens in Leninism, in that you have to sort of have an elected vanguard, you have to have a representative, sort of purity class or something like that, and then they will always be given a kind of a hidden hand over intervening upon the system. And then you've got what I would just vaguely describe as a runaway culture, which is like, held by these esoteric overlords and coordinators, or whatever, but it's done in some kind of intellectual sympathy with the people, it's done for the people, on behalf of the people, but essentially the state's business becomes the culture of the society. And we have essentially we have already ventured into that. And I do think that this is an intellectual heritage, as it were, from Napoleon. I think Napoleon actually invented this because it seemed like a natural progression from feudalism. I think that essentially it was a lack of imagination in envisioning a real liberal society in which the individual could actually, purvey their own affairs, as it were, and to reach some kind of equitable, sort of responsible, develop a kind of an accountability that would be self-refining, or something like that. So you have this is an intellectual tendency which I'm sure must have been tracked by other people in other sort of ideological analysis and things like that. You end up with a kind of the fear-bred centralization of power, or the fear-driven centralization of all power and influence. And once you've got that engine going, it can't stop itself, and it merely gets it supposedly gets more sophisticated. And what it really gets is essentially a more sensitive, vulnerable narcissism. It's interesting. I have heard from David Berlinski in an interview. He actually said that the SS actually had a long-term plan in which essentially even after, hypothetically, they had won the war and after they had sort of taken over everything, that essentially they would continue their euthanasia and their projects of purity on their own people until essentially only the SS would remain. That essentially the SS were the only, this is the things that the outgroup starts being drawn within the initial in-group. I think also there was like a two-stage thing. There's this idea that you have the kind of the Nazi propaganda and the rhetoric, which is like supposedly like a very safe psychological, sort of wavelength of existence. But then as soon as you're of a certain caliber, you sort of take the elevator within the ivory tower, and then you actually realize that actually we have to do some real thinking here, and this is all just a mind control for our people so that we can be in the position that we're in. It has this kind of internal cynicism about itself, in which it doesn't believe its own mythology to a large degree, or I mean, it literally can't, because if it did, it wouldn't be able to ever provide anything effective. But I mean, to some degree, you treat your own people like cattle, or like voting fodder or something like that, and you see, and the only thing that sort of that overlooks that is this idea of a collective identity, which actually vests all the moral consideration and integrity and dignity. So essentially, everyone has dignity and integrity vicariously via the identity, and so everyone can collectively be working for the exaltation of the identity, and then the state can sort of prove its efficacy by how it adorns the identity with some kind of, which is why the Nazis continued to, even when the Nazis were winning the war, they were very keen on creating these ritualistic, sort of burnings of books and things like that as they were cleansing themselves from the Jewish conspiracy. It's this the agitation against the infiltration, as it's ideologically conceived, is this sort of token of collective progress, and ironically, it sort of essentially seals the deal on their own internal suppression. I think the biggest argument against essentially decolonization is that it itself is a form of neocolonialization. It just seems to fly under the radar because it complains about being colonized, and essentially it says that we have the same superficial features as the people that were colonized in the past. So it essentially just sort of uses the excuse of history to conceal its own malignant and nefarious construction of this disgusting racialist soul, and sort of disguise its racial egoism as the medicine, as it makes the situation invariably worse and toxic and poisonous. And then it repurposes its own failings as its impetus for further control and demands, and radical, concentration of power in its political expression. All the while, its academic intellectual wing sort of trace the outline that sort of make it possible, but haven't quite grounded it yet. But then eventually, when they politically take over, they don't need that kind of pseudo-intellectualism, because they can just they can control the pulpit. They don't, and they'll be able to control dissent. They'll be able to you no longer need that much of an intellectual edifice when you can just literally take out your opponents and quash them. Take out your ideological opponents. And so this is sort of okay. So I was just trying to get into the point of how capitalism, and also, or you can call it privilege, is carrying a lot of water for them, but in the sense that if they weren't complaining about capitalism, and let's just say you did have some ulterior system, you did have something else completely, that there are things that are being ameliorated by the current structures, by even how privilege is even conceived of. There are components of privilege which, although they have some kind of historical thing, do you really want to create a society in which it is meaningless if your parents save and act responsibly? Do you really want to create a state in which the family has no capacity to make their own plan in terms of how they're going to sort of envisage and structure? It presupposes that the state is the only one that can sort of devise an education system, that privately there is no capacity, there is no imagination, there's no creativity to change anything, that nothing new can be tried that isn't sort of proposed by the state and imposed by the state, that there is nothing beyond the sort of a state auspiced, centralized role, like there's only one way to educate your children, and it is defined by the state. It requires a kind of the blind belief in a kind of in a one size fits all, lowest common denominator, one solution, one way, and it's almost the standardization of humanity becomes a kind of, somehow it becomes a virtue in order to facilitate this kind of ideological narrative and polemic. Now, obviously, there are many tragedies within this country. There is a huge amount of deprivation, and the state obviously needs to actually raise standards and things like that. But I mean, it's actually, at the moment, it actually works to undermine and lower standards in order to facilitate the equality which is seen as the outcome rather than the actual address of specific disadvantage. So there's this whole sort of shifted goalposts that if you just solve equality, if you bring about equality, it doesn't matter how you bring about equality, that will and I mean, that's the water that I'm saying that the liberal dimension that they overlook is carrying, that when they circumvent the liberal dimension, then you end up actually creating ulterior problems which you didn't even calculate into your disruptive ideological project. And so everything starts to sort of institutionally completely collapse because you've replaced, let's say, the common sense, common values vision of values and practical common sense. You've just displaced that with this ideological integrity, with this ideological version of fidelity to which is completely obsessed with this metric of like equality or something like that. Yeah, so it's and it's interesting because the kind of disruption that causes then causes the kind of divisiveness which promotes the kind of confusion that allows them to conceal the things that they need to conflate in order to project their narrative in the first place. So it's a self-agonizing, self-duplicating, sort of fascistic, mind-forged manacle, in which then it looks like that the state must control culture because things are getting out of hand, because people are using hate speech to dismantle the government's ideological project and this intellectual academic, pseudo movement that well, it's not it is a movement which I get tired of describing it with adjectives. It's where everyone is incentivized essentially to add to the excitement, to create the kind of interpretation of events which are compliant with its narrative, and it is quite disgusting because, the kind of, let's say, I want to call it self-censorship, which becomes this new moral that comes to reign over the public sphere, that you can't say things that are inconvenient for the ideology, and journalists, I think, are very aware of this. And they also are used to now feeding the bloodthirsty, vulnerable narcissists the meat that they want. So you only give them the stories that exacerbate their self-righteous anger, and you only show stories in such a light so as to placate that ideological interpretation. And so there's a tremendous kind of editorial emphasis on crafting the kind of propaganda that exacerbates and the kind of the identity consciousness which government essentially invoked when it decided not to target disadvantage as criteria for getting special treatment, but they just said, no, your identity is what is disadvantaged, and everyone who has that identity is disadvantaged. It doesn't matter if you're a black kleptocrat, politically connected, part of this new plutocratic elite, or if you are poor. Obviously the people that have more access to wealth are going to invariably be closer, it helps everyone who almost would have got there already by themselves, or the handful of the few that have essentially gotten the concentration of the state's regulatory beneficence, and the problem with that is that that doesn't come for free. It comes at a kind of systemic cost. So it's interesting that there is such a thing as a kind of systemic disruption, and all these disruptions and sabotage essentially are just counted as being good because it's decreasing the wealth of a section of the population more than it's decreasing the wealth of it's focusing the hurt on the people that have, let's just say, more. And then it's interesting because they count that as a win for equality in some sense. On paper it is, but it's not a win for actually bringing people up. It's not a win for helping alleviate poverty, because if people have less capital to reinvest and you create an environment that is impossible to invest into because there is no future for you, if you don't have the right skin color, you are not welcome. There's this sort of, all the people that I know that have fled the country, at least while I was growing up, they were all entrepreneurial people that could tell, essentially, they anticipated that the trajectory of policy was against them and that there was just going to be more and more racial quotas and mandates, and that they were essentially the wrong color to do business in this country. And I'm talking about people that are essentially the kind of sort of like working class version of entrepreneurs, like that kind of micro business. And I guess they have been proven right that essentially the country is hostile to small and medium businesses. It doesn't want to see this government-led development is just fundamentally I would say that it's so stupid. It could have been more effective than it was, but it still, I would say, doesn't compare to what you could have done if you just allowed yourself to go through a teething stage and develop small and medium business and promote small and medium business by not essentially destroying them with over-regulation. And then, we would have actually been in a much better position in terms of unemployment and growth. But we've never been able to develop, essentially, because of the imposition of these sorts of highfalutin redistribution based on identity, which has facilitated the concentration of wealth with kleptocrats. So we have essentially an artificial black elite, the weight of which has caused a level of disruption to the entire system and also polluted, let's say, the institutional integrity, because of how, all the kind of the imposition of double standards and all these sorts of things, which, you're not allowed to talk about, you're not allowed to shed light on, because then it's tantamount to it's on the border of hate speech, and this is their vision of a liberal state, obviously it's not a liberal state, but this is somehow they still keep the window dressing of the Constitution, even though they've utterly eviscerated it and betrayed it. They've betrayed non-racialism, they've betrayed an open liberal society is not what it is, and their excuse is essentially their own failing. To make effective policy and that actually solves the situation, therefore they can make it even less liberal, and they can misinterpret social justice to mean its absolute opposite, and they can instrumentalize its citizenry and treat them as part of their identity drama, in which moral consideration is divested from the individual and put into the identity. Okay, now I'm just repeating myself, but I think I did extenuate that point, so that's going to be enough. So this is another sort of very minor point tacked onto what I was talking about the difference in totalitarian styles between, for example, Leninism and fascism. But in the Leninist sort of thing, the propaganda and the indoctrination is necessitated by a kind of an immediate ideological threat. Essentially, I guess the ideology, which you're intellectually sort of associated with or affiliated with as necessary as to guard you against the thing that it's negating and obviating and securing you against. So you're being armored with class consciousness, essentially, in the Leninist sort of strange. Because in Leninism there is also a level of deceit in which the vanguard is orchestrating state capitalism, but they sort of, the propaganda is that you're actually in state socialism, although it's, that's why I just like to refer to it as Leninism, but anyway, I mean, that's its own sort of thing. Whereas in fascism, it's not necessary, the reason why it's necessary is not because of a merely defensive maneuver. It's because there's positive value in that you can only connect with your identity via this sort of state-endorsed culture that is like wedded with the state, and that is this big happy family, as it were, in terms of a shared ethnicity that the state is like directly imposing and protecting and also valuing and dignifying, and it's happening through the auspices of state power. But it's also it's more insidious, I believe, because essentially it's saying that the state has a right essentially to or is at least ostensibly the first line of defense against or for the identity, but is also the first promoter of the identity, is the avatar of the the spirit of the identity, and the state power is the majesty of the identity, and so vicariously the individual is sharing the enjoyment of the state via the identity. But that is a much more insidious form of control, because it's sort of like it's imprinted on the emotional sort of like landscape. That is interesting as well, because the state is almost perpetrating the vulnerable narcissism on your behalf, and you get to just sort of be its sort of like infantilized underling in some sense, that you are just just play your role, stay in your lane according to the kind of the identity matrix which is being arbitrated and being preserved and enforced, according to the sophisticated things that are kind of like group sourced in some kind of collective, so it really has this really dehumanizing hive model of humanity, in which that you are just part of this cog of this sort of conglomerated aggregation of moral consideration that sort of confuses and diffuses this idea of epistemic agency and responsibilism as something that has to be invested in some kind of sociological construct and reduction, which has to be institutionally given the kind of the leveraging power and the might to pervade over the contentions that it is conceptually outlined as doing. And so you have to become just instrumental to that process, that overarching, pervading sort of thing that's happening above your head. And I mean, how people can't recognize that is circumventing epistemic agency and epistemic responsibilism and forcing people into a drama. You see, like I think they do have some idea that it is a bit of a gambit on some level, which I technically describe as that, to fix the hypothetical damage that belongs to the vicarious identity or something like that people are tapping into via the identity. Because the damage is done to the identity, and then the identity must be vindicated against the other instrumentalist citizenry or whatever to help the reconsideration and the sort of the redistribution of some kind of cultural attribute or something like that, that is all constructive to the redress. That essentially it's only justified when the outcome is positive of that process. So it's completely committed to the expectation, that it's not committed to the principle, to the philosophy. It's just committed essentially to the false prophecy of what is being anticipated and expected. So it's strange that essentially the actual mechanism itself is the only justification functionally for its machinations and its orchestration of everything. Um, and that is just generalized. That situation essentially is just generally sort of existentially justified as being, well, that is what humanity means. Is it means to be part of an ethnicity. It means to be part of this sort of this vague mythological root or whatever, like it's just, it allows it to be confused that way. And in so doing, it completely disperses the notions of humanism, and it obviates and negates non-racialism. It is very antagonistic against non-racialism, therefore, because it cannot allow anything that would otherwise bring reason and soundness into its convolution of this sort of Ponzi scheme that it is perpetrating, and then essentially it just uses this extreme passive aggressiveness in order to insulate itself and encapsulate its process from the challenge that self-reflection would impose upon it. So it's very allergic to any kind of self-knowledge and humility. It is completely wedded to this hubristic sort of like, the ends will justify the means, and the means will be precipitated in an outcome that our ideology anticipates, and we'll just keep on going until it does, because otherwise the process that we've been engaged in and promoting and advocating will be seen as hollow, and we can't allow that to happen because the orthodoxy is just so convenient, it's just so expedient, it's just so, it's too technically sweet, is kind of its impetus. And the truth is that it's sweet for these armchair philosophers and these tin pot dictators and plutocrats. That's what it is actually sweet for. It's sweet for people that can sort of then have the moral milieu that justifies their articulation of a kind of legal positivism and moral positivism that they can just dictate and depict as this is the code that enshrines the orthodoxy, which means that you can't generate the hate speech that would, cast doubt on our moral perch and our monopolization of moral authority. It's very interesting that there's like a moral analog for all the things that they complain about. They complain about monopolization, but they essentially monopolize kind of a moral authority, which they speciously found and which they speciously encapsulate and insulate from actual legitimate intellectual challenge. It's a self-propelling, self-agonizing devastation machine, and it is just a giant diversion, because by forcing everything to be conceptualized by their incomplete, unfinished conceptual outlook, it just creates enough chaos to essentially get away with the because I guess one of the biggest problems is that just how insensitive it is to its own double standards, to its own cherry-picked narrative construction and such, and just how how it facilitates essentially the kind of echo chamber. Again, I do think the vulnerable narcissism is the best way of modeling it. Okay, I'm now going to make a sort of a further, very dry and technical point, which has that caveat that I had at the beginning, that this tends to give it a bit too much credence, because it should be derailed before the charity that I have to animate it with in order to debunk it. So this can sort of be taken badly out of context, but just in order to better picture how this ideology functions. So it's quite ironic. It is in fact very ironic, because it in fact inflicts the thing that it supposedly complains about, which is, I would say, a trait which is also like analogous to how vulnerable narcissism is like fundamentally structured, because there's something almost metaphysical about, like the internal character becomes the destiny in that sort of sense, or the internal contention of metaphysic becomes the drama that sort of precipitates from engaging in that mode of being, or something like that. But okay, let me just get into the technical. So in reaction to the epistemicide that can be hypothetically undone, I think that's almost a very technical way of showing how the damage is hypothetical in that sense, in that the idea that you can react to epistemicide in a way that undoes hypothetical damage, or at least in terms of how it is, whatever sort of process, whatever sort of ad hoc administration you want of it, because that hasn't been substantiated or grounded, I guess. I think technically it's correct to say that. Okay, anyway. Let me just read this note. In reaction to the epistemicide, inverted commas, that can only be hypothetically undone, your ad hoc process hopes to be. Your ad hoc process hopes to perpetrate an equal and opposite form of epistemicide against an effigy which is also hypothetically constructed in an equal and opposite modeling of historical injustice onto the present context. So you're almost taking an effigy of the historical epistemicide, and then you're sort of creating an effigy of it in the present so that you can sort of try to undo the epistemicide. Now I'm going to get into the sort of the hidden subtextual premises in these. It seems that kind of project is inherently trying to. So now I'm going to make a sort of an argument as to the hidden premises within that. In order to redistributively and retributively account for an imbalance caused by the historical epistemicide, this sloppiness can only be mended by constructing a self-identity which permits itself to label as either a non-vicarious relativism or a valid vicarious experience. So it's either non-vicarious and then it becomes relativistic, or it has to sort of self-identify as a vicarious experience which is like empirically grounded or semantically grounded or something like, which is sort of that sort of disguises its which then can sort of claim to be non-relativistic because it has some kind of other collateral explanation and substantiation for itself. So it has to sort of found the vicarious, so it uses some kind of determinism or some kind of, like knock-on effects, like, I'm part of the system, it's all the same medium or something like that. So it ends up creating a kind of a vicarious reduction or conflation that then can sort of escape the non-relativistic label. Now, this, I think, is all just sophistry and semantics. Like, whether it's going to be a non-vicarious relativism or something that tries to sort of save its vicarious experience of the epistemicide and saying, no, I have actually experienced the epistemicide because of this valid vicarious form of experiencing it, and that is not a relativistic claim. It's fundamentally dubious. But okay, so now the reason why it's fundamentally dubious is because epistemicide can only ever occur from an immediate context at some point, and that immediate context can only come in the form of two types. It can come in the form of people who directly experience the epistemicide and they are no longer alive. So then it is complete. The epistemicide is done. The damage is done. Or people who essentially experienced an incomplete epistemicide because they're still alive. So either, so essentially, so in some sense, the only way that any of this works, if it is an incomplete epistemicide, or it is an epistemicide that is like close to being finished or completed or something like that. There's this kind of it's the threat of epistemicide. It hasn't actually happened. Um, yeah, all these sort of these sort of conceptual. Now, if you want to follow any of these threads, they're all useless. They don't you can't get anything sound out of this stuff. You can try to create a narrative that is sort of like creates an invariable within its own self-consistency, which then becomes a kind of totalitarian orthodoxy. That's the only way to actually ground it. I mean, that's how it's been sociologically constructed. That's how it operates as a political consciousness. And it does so by eviscerating and by essentially labeling any kind of epistemic responsibilism and its political outgrowth or political representation in terms of the ideology of kind of the British liberal political moral consideration is invested in individuals primarily, not in some kind of ethnocentric relativism, not in some kind of group identity, not in some kind of vague umbrella which you're going to try to usher humanity into, and then use that filtration system to sort of impose ad hoc administration and legal positivistic corruption of a culture that becomes governed from the top down, essentially. And while excusing itself in some kind of vulnerable narcissism. I do think that this is the overarching poison that generally the West, you could call, or the Anglosphere, I mean, primarily I would say it's the sort of the British from their political realism in how they have structured their politics. That really was an ingenious window into essentially the pragmatic unfolding of and protection of, let's say, the sacred intellectual soul, you could say it, by preserving the realm of the individual and according it with the rights and not with although it's hard to see how it is pristinely protected in a context in which Parliament is sovereign. In some sense, that's the political realism of essentially compromising with the fact that, well, if you have a majority in your population that just don't want to have a liberal open society, it's not going to be preserved. So in some sense, they preserve it by emphasizing its cultural import because it's not built into the structure, or it's not built into the law. They don't have a supreme constitution. They have an unwritten constitution, which, preserves itself. Anyway, getting too much into this political stuff, but whereas this kind of, intellectual sophistry and pseudo-intellectualism that tries to ground itself in some kind of sociological reduction so that it can try to escape its own dependence and implicit reliance on relativistic conceptual outlines and components of its ideological outlook and its of its narrative. I mean, the whole thing is up in the air. It's sort of it has never been conceived in fully. It's the sort of some kind of crazy thing that's half completed, written on a wall somewhere, like graffitied, and it's sort of and the idea is, oh, well, it's just so beautiful and it seems to capture so much. We just have to give it more attention, give it more funding, give it more political and cultural and philosophical credence, and be subservient to it because that is kind of how how it allows us to alleviate us of this systemic guilt or something like that, of this sort of original sin that has been inherited by the system that it is projecting and depicting onto us. And essentially it's just the crazy ramblings of yet another cult of vulnerable narcissism, as our species is fundamentally prone. That is, it's, the Nazis did it. Like it's not a racial thing. It's not even a tribal thing. It's a specious form of intellectual poison, and it will. I believe it will always take root everywhere that it is not actively suppressed. If you do not have a clear ethical framework that obviates and negates this bullshit, then it just takes over naturally. It automatically, by default, it will. If you don't have something that like is on the lookout for it, and that sort of tries to get people that have this kind of temperament out of power, out of positions where they pervade this kind of disgusting orthodoxy, and get it operating, because I mean they just essentially they have a corrupt temperament. They like this kind of idea that they are going to be the agents of enforcing this kind of sadistic, sort of policing it gives them something to do. It gives them an ideological excuse for their sadistic, sort of gainsaying and their sadistic projection onto people, so that they can feel morally superior as they get their sadistically edged, vulnerable narcissism kicks off, and so it has a toxic effect, because once you have this as a moral hegemon, then children respond to this, and children can pick up on this, and it is a very alluring power, because essentially you're giving people the power of relativism, and you're saying, because of the cultural hegemon, because of the current orthodoxy, you're not allowed to stop them from doing it. So you can have children bully their teachers with it. You can have the most hideous sort of conflagrations developing around this, because you've essentially said vulnerable narcissism is okay if you're this part of the population, if you are supporting this ideological outlook. If you're promoting identity politics, if you're advocating for identity politics, your vulnerable narcissism is sanctioned. And we're even going to create legal protections so that you can get yours off, and other people that you're codependently engaged in, because you need to have the equal and opposite kind of vulnerable narcissism to help secure your narrative as being, because it's kind of like it becomes this self-fulfilling prophecy where it kicks up enough, sort of confusion and murkiness, and it agitates people, and then it records their agitation as falling into the prediction of its narrative that, oh, look, there is oppression, there is systemic oppression, look at how everyone criticizes me, so therefore there is systemic oppression. It has that kind of it is the seed of its own spiraling self-indulgence and decadence, and selective reality filtering, and it just gets more and more insulated. So I mean, I would say that to me is that somehow the epistemicide is happening always. So it's this total civil war that never ends. That's the only way that you can justify it, is that it's not just that it did happen, but that because it did happen, it is still happening, and it will always be happening in some sense. And there's no way to argue for or against that either, and there's no way to argue whether you've actually finished it or not. I mean, that you can only sort of get that if you, in fact, I mean, there are some ways in which you can get it, know that you've done something, but you have to do something very radical. Essentially, you have to sort of wipe the slate clean, which essentially means you have to purge your entire population of whatever the historical effigy is of the historical oppression. But even that won't be enough, because then you will also have secondary things. Okay, no, but the infiltration went deeper. Our minds are still colonized, so it never, it, it needs its agitation. In fact, it actually needs that kind of narrative, because, if it ever has to give up this sort of moral authority machine, it it might actually have to self reflect and take stock of things and like empirically, make some inconvenient things to it. So it's sort of, it actually has this built-in sort of bad faith that has to continually be, um, that impels it forward further, because otherwise you have to actually look at the cost, let's just say, of your own ad hoc process that you've been engaged in, and you have to sort of measure that against alternatives, and then you have to say, oh, what there was actually something wrong with this moral procedure that I was administering, like, that's uncomfortable for the ideological diagnosis. So if the procedure is ineffectual, then the diagnosis is called into question, and then the integrity and validity of this, and then, at what point is it ever capable of admitting fault? Which is effectively what vulnerable narcissism intellectually is guarding itself against reflecting on, because it can always just excuse, in some sense, it can complain that it can complain that its own action wasn't radical enough, but it can never complain that it was like fundamentally off on the wrong track, that it was fundamentally, you know, um, it has no facility within itself because it has discarded its epistemic agency, and because it already has conceded ground to being in reaction to epistemicide, and to live out that narrative and drama, and propel that subsequent drama. Um, but again, like, who does this epistemicide that was historical, who does it belong to? Does it belong to the dead? Does it belong to, how does it vicariously persist? How can it be recovered? If it belongs to, if the epistemicide occurred to people who are no longer around, how is it recoverable? The idea that it's going to be virtually recoverable, you're going to simulate its recovery by simply taking a retributivistic, you know, um, pound of flesh, uh, and who are you going to give that flesh to? Like, this is the kind of the thing that some representative has to take that pound of flesh, and this is the facility of the kind of state corruption that has been facilitated by this moral corruption, which is completely unconstitutional. Now I'm just repeating myself. Um, Again, everything that I've just said in this little segment would not make good political rhetoric. I'm just trying to get into, like, as deeply as I can, the nuts and bolts of the technical oversight, which is being perpetrated.